Bibliophiles of the internet, we have somehow made it through another month, and it's time for me to share my thoughts on everything I read in May. I read 14 books in May, so let's just jump right into the first book I finished, which was Change of Plans by Sarah Dessen. I was kindly sent a review copy by Simon Teen, and this came out on May 5th. This is a YA contemporary story about Finley, who's very comfortable letting other people make choices about her life, and it's been working out for her so far because her longtime boyfriend is very charismatic and often pulls her into all his activities and plans. But even though one of their plans was to go to college together, he unceremoniously dumps her at the beginning of the summer right after graduation, and now it feels like all her plans have gone up in smoke. To make things worse, her emotionally distant mother decides to take her on a last-minute road trip to a family vacation house that Finley never even knew existed, and the only reason they're going back now is because her mom's family has to sell the house, clear it out for prospective buyers, etc., and the longer they stay there, the more she's learning about why her mom might have kept this place and these people secret for so much of her life. Content warnings for explorations of terminal illness and guilt, estranged parent-child relationship, and some depictions of underage drinking and drunkenness. Sarah Dessen was one of the authors I read the most from growing up, and it's been well over a decade, if not longer, since I've read anything from her. So seeing her make a comeback in 2026 was a very pleasant surprise, and I found this book to be delightfully nostalgic and comforting in so many familiar ways. This book is like prototypical, quintessential Sarah Dessen. It very much feels like a return to form, but also like she never left. This book has all those Sarah Dessen hallmarks that her longtime readers have come to enjoy and expect. There's a teenage character navigating emotional upheaval, complex family dynamics, poignant metaphors, the promise of found family, and a really sweet underlying romance to tie everything together. I will say, Sarah Dessen is of a much different generation than the one she's writing for, which is not at all a knock against her, and in some ways it feels like this is not a story that's reflective of what teenagers are actually like in 2026. But with that said, there are still some really valuable messages baked in here that I think will resonate for younger audiences. The story has a lot to say about taking risks, taking charge of your own life even when it's scary or even when whatever comes next is unclear, and about reckoning with the fact that change is one of the only constants in life, and we can either fight against it or allow it to help us make the best choices we can for ourselves. So overall, there was a lot here to enjoy. Again, it felt like reading a classic Sarah Dessen book back in 2009, and yet there are still new and meaningful things to take away from this story that set it apart from some of her other books. In the end, I gave this a solid 4 stars. After that, I took part in a book tour with Color Pages Book Tours for a recently released YA book called Shapes of Love by Elvi Peñalba. I received a review copy courtesy of Wednesday Books for the tour and an ALC from Libro FM, which is read by Meiko Gavia, and it came out on May 19th. This is a queer contemporary story about a teenage pop star known as Sasha, whose first album has been super successful. And as her star continues to rise, her fandom keeps growing and folks become more and more invested in trying to figure out who inspires the love songs she writes. What no one knows is that she's actually happily aro ace, and she doesn't write about love from her own personal experiences or from a romantic perspective, but instead she takes inspiration from her own favorite fandoms and ships. One day she runs into her estranged friend Kai, and while they're catching up, they get photographed together, and those photos get leaked to the press, causing an online firestorm as people hypothesize that this must be the long-lost ex who broke Sasha's heart. So in order to avoid backlash from her fandom and from the press, she and Kai agree to do a fake PR relationship for 6 months, which will actually give them time to repair their platonic relationship in the process. Content warnings for experienced aphobia and queerphobia, some depictions of underage drinking and vomit, some depictions of online harassment, including death threats, and some explorations of public outing with side characters. Also worth noting, Sasha is not only queer and aro ace, but she and her therapist are also exploring a possible autism diagnosis. Kai is a questioning bisexual, and another character named Asher is pansexual and questioning whether he is aromantic. This was one of those cases where I had never heard of this book before the book tour signups landed in my inbox, and just the mention of an aro ace love story immediately made my ears perk up. So I went with my gut in signing up for the tour, and ultimately I'm really glad that I did because I think there's a lot here to appreciate. First of all, I think platonic love stories and stories that celebrate the deep, world-shifting love that can exist between friends and that can also exist for ourselves, with ourselves, are every bit as needed and every bit as compelling as romantic stories, and I think this book is absolutely helping to make that case. Something specific I really appreciate about this book is that it gives Sasha space to have complicated feelings about her own identity and her queerness. I think non-queer people assume that once you find your label, everything about your life magically falls into place, and the sense of rightness you've discovered in being able to name an essential part of yourself is enough to sustain you for the rest of your days, when that couldn't be more reductive and that couldn't be further from the truth. What this story really understands is that there are two sides to every coin. Of course, there is something fundamentally empowering about knowing who you are, being able to freely express who you are, and be celebrated for who you are. But especially for queer folks who identify with micro-labels, that can also be a reminder of how you don't fit into a world where your existence was never anticipated, and where your baseline may never ever become the norm. There are so many small ways in which Aro Ace people specifically might experience grief for not being able to take part in what are seen as normative milestones and lifestyles, where we are not invited to add the multitudes of ways we do or do not experience love and attraction to the larger social conversation. So I respect that this story gives Sasha space to express perfectly valid grief and loneliness that often accompanies Aro Ace identities, but at the same time, her loneliness, her grief, her jealousy is not what defines her experience of queerness. Thematically, I also appreciate what this story has to say about how the idea of love is not something that should be dictating the shape of our lives, but rather something of our own making that we actively shape into or fit into our lives depending on what we need, what we feel, and what we experience. And there's also a lot to consider in regards to how we dramatically narrow the scope of the human experience when we assume that romantic love is the only kind of love that matters, and when the only love stories we revere as a society are the romantic ones. There are so many other ways to share love and to experience love. I will say I wish there was more focus on the relationship between Sasha and Kai. I feel like we get a little bit of healing from them at the beginning of the story, but then Kai disappears somewhat in the second half as he goes on his own sort of side quest. So I think the relationship dynamics overall could have been a bit stronger. Some of these sticking points could have been more nuanced. So for those reasons, I gave this a strong 3.75 stars. Then I picked up my galley of Opting Out by Maya Kobabe and Lucky Shrikumar. This also came out on May 5th, and I got my galley courtesy of Scholastic. This is a queer middle grade graphic novel about a young gender-questioning South Asian kid named Sachi who doesn't really want her body to change, but is also having to face the reality of puberty while all her friends at school suddenly start taking an interest in things like dating, fashion, and gendered activities. So the story is about Sachi having to come to terms with the fact that change is inevitable, but that doesn't mean she has to lose sight of her own identity or stop being herself. Content warnings for some depictions of bullying and assault, brief depictions of injury, some experienced racism, and explorations of gender dysphoria, transphobia, and queerphobia. If you don't know, Maya Kobabe wrote Genderqueer, one of the most challenged and banned books in the history of the United States, so it's encouraging to see that all of that adversity and censorship hasn't stopped them from creating and sharing invaluable queer stories for younger audiences. I think this graphic novel is tackling the concept of puberty, growing up, and navigating growing pains in a way that's not only realistic, but also deeply relatable regardless of how you experience or understand gender and regardless of whether you share the character's queer identity or not. Like, yes, there's definitely a lot in here about how jarring it feels to confront black and white gender roles and gendered ideas for the first time, how confusing it feels to go from an age where the gender playing field is relatively level to an age where suddenly everything you do and feel and think about has some kind of gendered expectation attached to it. But the story also takes an honest look at what it means to navigate your body changing, your friendship dynamics changing, your interest in the things you care about changing or not changing. And those are things that any kid of any background and any experience can relate to. I also appreciate what this story has to say about staying true to yourself and holding on to the parts of yourself that you like and care about the most, even as life changes around you. Because yes, none of us can avoid change. It's a perfectly natural, if uncomfortable, part of life. But that also doesn't mean we have to forget or sacrifice the parts of us that make us ourselves in the process. So overall, I appreciate what this story is doing, and I'm very glad that it exists. I gave it a solid 4.25 stars. After that, I listened to one of my most anticipated 2026 releases. I am, of course, referring to The Last Contract of Isako by Fonda Lee. I pre-ordered the audiobook, which is read by Mary Robinette Kowal and Dylan Sickles. This is billed as a standalone sci-fi epic set on a distant, resource-restricted planet where corporations are basically battling over how they want to continue developing this planet, and the most powerful, wealthy CEOs and politicians are able to hire these corporate samurais as independent contractors. These contractors fulfill a number of different purposes. They're personal bodyguards, they're business experts and consultants, they work in espionage to help attack and sabotage their clients' competition, and Isako is one of the most legendary swordswomen still working in this space. But when her longtime client unexpectedly retires, she expects to quickly follow suit, but she learns that her contract has instead been transferred to one of her client's competitors, and she's offered one last mission involving one of her most promising proteges. And once she starts poking around what he's gotten himself tangled up in, she realizes it could very well change the fate of all all humankind. Content warnings for graphic depictions of violence, injury, blood, and death, brief depictions of and references to suicide, explorations of classism, and some depictions of drug use and drug abuse. This is Fondelee's first new full-length novel since finishing the Greenbone Saga, which I consider to be one of the best trilogies of any genre to ever be published. So my expectations going into this were sky high, and I'm very happy to report that those expectations were absolutely met. If there's one thing you should know about Fondelee, it's that if she writes something, it's gonna be cool as fuck. That's not up for debate, that's not up for interpretation. Everything she writes is fundamentally badass and will make you feel like a badass by association for reading it. And this was no exception. Corporate samurais are not something I ever would have thought I needed in my life, but Fondelee very quickly proved me wrong on that front. Not only is there a clear and engaging underlying mystery plot that propels this story forward, but the world building is also deeply interesting, and so many of the social and cultural norms we take for granted are put into a radically different perspective. The way these characters think about professional careers and retirement, child rearing and child care, and even the stakes of what it means for any given corporation to gain control over the others is wildly different than the world we know. And I found that aspect of discovery underscoring the quickly moving plot of the story to be just as carefully considered as the overarching storyline itself. At the end of the day, this book showcases all the things Fondelee does so incredibly well. Shadowy corporate sabotage, an exploration of humankind's inclination towards corruption, breathtaking action sequences, hardened characters having to contend with their role in upholding corporate greed and corruption, while also showing a whole new side to her writing with this deeply fascinating sci-fi world that she's building out as the story progresses. It's also refreshing and exciting to see an epic sci-fi story told from the perspective of an older BIPOC female character, especially because Isako's age and the way her body is changing as she gets older brings something really interesting to the table and serves to really underscore the stakes of this mission with every bodily and professional risk that she takes. I also really appreciate that Isako is being challenged when it comes to her values and beliefs, especially as someone who's been in this game for so long, and especially because she has so strictly adhered to the contractor code regarding loyalty to the client and valuing efficiency over everything and anything else. These are things that she's never questioned, and she's finally running into scenarios that are making her question what that code really means, why it was created, who it benefits, and where her conscience and personal boundaries factor into it, or don't factor into it, as the case may be. So on top of this being a well-structured, well-paced, action-packed sci-fi epic, it also gives you a lot to think about in terms of morality and integrity and how those things factor into the legacies that we leave behind, but also what does a worthwhile legacy even look like to begin with. I do feel like Isako's personal relationships and aspects of her backstory could have been better developed to emphasize the stakes, especially because we're supposed to buy into the idea that those are the things that motivate her to begin with. But that's a very minor note. This was still cool as hell, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then as part of another book tour, I read Startup Hell by Caitlin Rezakis. This came out on May 19th, and I was kindly sent a review copy and a finished copy courtesy of Titan Books. This is an over-the-top, zany, satirical contemporary fantasy about a character named Morgan, whose mom just happens to be this kick-ass, world-saving demon hunter. But Morgan doesn't have any magical abilities herself, so she's stuck working as a low-level sales rep for a shady startup company that doesn't even know what its main product is. One day after work, she discovers her boss is dead in his office after attempting to summon a demon so he could trade his soul in exchange for making his quarterly target. But now the demon in question, Luke, is in a sticky situation because he can't return back to hell until he makes a deal for someone's soul. And obviously Morgan is not going to offer up hers. So now they're stuck together until they can find some way to finish out this demonic contract. And the company's douchebag tech bro CEO might just be the perfect target. Content warnings for depictions of death, some descriptions of injury and violence, some instances of bullying, workplace harassment, and misogyny, and some fade to black sexual content. This was my first time reading from Caitlin Rezakis, but I can say with absolute certainty that it will not be the last. This was such a fun, cheeky, chaotic story that doesn't take itself too seriously, but is still able to deliver an incisive takedown of corporate America in all its abject soullessness. I think the parallel between Morgan's job as a sales rep and Luke's job to contract souls as a demon is not only hilarious, but also uncanny because in a way their endgame is very similar and demands a kind of sacrifice. At the same time, while the story absolutely critiques the predatory nature of startups and corporate office culture, it doesn't unilaterally condemn every single person who works in those spaces. There's also compassion in the sense that these characters stuck in these horrendous dead-end jobs jobs are just trying their best to survive, and they're not inherently evil for being trapped in those systems themselves. I think the story also raises some really interesting questions about how the rise of corporate office culture preys on the human desire to belong somewhere and be a part of something, to the point where we are encouraged to allow our work to subsume the entirety of our identity, our energy, our purpose, our existence. One thing Morgan is having to contend with in this story is the fact that she's allowed her job to become conflated with her personhood. She has no life or identity outside of her work. She has to actively work on pulling back energy from this company that ultimately doesn't care about her and reallocating that energy into what actually brings her joy and purpose that has nothing to do with her job or bulking up her resume. And to that end, there's a really great through line in this story about how Morgan's wants and needs feel very small and simplistic, and therefore they pale in comparison to everything else happening in her life and in the world at large. But she's learning that that doesn't mean they don't have value and worth, that the things we want and need in life will always matter simply because we want them and we need them. And also at the same time, we as individuals may not be able to change the world by ourselves or even see significant change in our lifetimes, but if we all try to make our little corners of the world better in some way, that does move the needle and it does make a difference. So I enjoyed seeing Morgan work through those complicated questions of morality, purpose, and work-life balance in her own wacky way. The slow burn romance developing between Morgan and Luke was also delightfully charming to read. I do think there were maybe one too many plot elements in the mix that made the endgame feel somewhat murky, especially towards the end, but this was still a super fun, super smart story, and I gave it an even 4 stars. The next 3 books I didn't actually read back to back, but they are part of the same series, so I'm going to talk about them together. I was able to catch up with the Singing Hill cycle by Niveau. I read books 5, 6, and 7, The Brides of High Hill, A Mouthful of Dust, and A Long and Speaking Silence, and these were all kindly sent to me by the folks at Tor.com. Broadly speaking, this is a queer fantasy novella series following a non-binary cleric known as Cleric Chi, who basically travels around this fantasy world through different regions in order to collect relics, histories, and stories so that they can be preserved for future generations. In the 5th book, they're traveling with a young bride as she is set to wed the aging ruler of a crumbling estate. In the 6th book, they're investigating the history of a country plagued by a historic famine that almost wiped out the entire populace. And the 7th book is actually a prequel of sorts, where Chi is living in a river town where the sudden arrival of refugees is causing a commotion among the locals who are not interested in welcoming these refugees. General content warnings for these 3 books include depictions of death and violence, some allusions to sexual violence, some depictions of ableism, allusions to famine, starvation, and cannibalism, references to suicide, explorations of xenophobia, racism, and violence against refugees, some instances of domestic abuse and child abuse, and some explorations of grief. I'll speak about these novellas very generally and very briefly, but I thought these were 3 more stellar installments in what's been a really remarkable novella series. I have so much admiration for how this series is structured and set up. The concept of a traveling cleric gathering stories from different regions is broad enough that it allows for such a wide variety of stories and even varieties of subgenres within the fantasy space to be explored throughout the series, and it also makes each installment a truly standalone reading experience. I also just love the feel and general flow of the series. It feels very folkloric, and because each book is a self-contained short story, each installment is able to feel uniquely allegorical in its own way and explore compelling yet self-contained ideas. The 5th book is about opening our eyes to the darkness and corruption all around us that tries to hide itself in plain sight. The 6th book is about how desperation can make monsters of us all if we allow it to. And the 7th book is about how stories are not just completed relics for us to discover after the fact. There are stories we are still collectively living through and that we can still shape in our own ways. So there are definitely moments of brilliance in each of these novellas, and again, even though the style, tone, and aesthetic can vary from installment to installment, the series is still able to feel connected and cohesive, which I think is an incredible feat. In my opinion, these 3 novellas in particular just got better and better and better. So I gave The Brides of High Hill 4.5 stars, A Mouthful of Dust 4.5 stars, and A Long and Speaking Silence a full 5 stars. I also listened to The Killing Spell by Shea Kawe. I was kindly sent a galley by Saga Press. It came out on April 14th, and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Barry Kealoha. This is a contemporary fantasy that imagines an alternate history where 200 years ago there was a catastrophic flood that completely submerged the Hawaiian Islands and unleashed magic into the world. So now the surviving Hawaiian clans live in what's known as the Homestead on the very outskirts of Los Angeles, and the main character, Kea, is the youngest of the Hawaiian clan leaders and one of the only people with any understanding of their unique Hawaiian Hawaiian language magic. That ends up getting her into some hot water when it comes to light that Angelo Reyes, LA's most prominent Filipino activist, has been murdered, and the death spell that killed him is something that can only exist in Hawaiian language magic. So Kea becomes one of the primary suspects embroiled in this case, and now it's up to her to prove the innocence of her clan and herself by tracking down the real killer before it's too late. Content warnings for explorations of colonization and colonial violence, depictions of injury, violence, and death, some instances of experienced classism and misogyny, and brief depictions of sexual harassment and sexual assault. I thought this was a really compelling fantasy debut. It's bringing something really interesting and unique to the table, especially where the magic system and the concept of language magic is concerned. I found that to be really thoughtfully integrated into Kea's character arc, as well as the overall concept of contending with legacies of colonial violence. I think what I appreciate most about this debut is that there's no shortage of action. It's fast-paced, the world building is very thoughtfully and organically integrated into the story, there's humor, there's elements of found family, but as fun and exciting as the story is, it's also very much about learning to kill the colonizer that lives within us. Kea is in a really interesting situation where culturally she is native Hawaiian, but she's also lived a lot of her life on the outskirts of California, having to speak English and assimilate herself and her clan into the dominant white culture in so many ways just so that they might survive. But there's also no stability or certainty for her within that sort of culturally liminal space. So she possesses this unique native Hawaiian language magic, and within this reimagined world, different languages and even different dialects possess unique magical properties. But she's not always able to access the full recesses of her own power because, in many ways, she feels disconnected from her cultural heritage, her ancestors, and even herself. So a grand majority of the story is about Kea unlearning all the limitations and misconceptions that her colonizers have forced upon her and convinced her is the norm, when actually there's a rich precedent of expansive possibility that is her real cultural inheritance. She's having to let go of this idea that she has to be perfect, that her Hawaiian has to be textbook, that she has to perform authentically, whatever that means, in order for her magic to be the most powerful it can be. And I think that's a really powerful realization for her to be grappling with. I will say this book does feel like a debut at times, by which I mean it's nonstop and action-packed, and a lot of interesting and exciting things happen in a short span of time, but then there's not always space given to really linger on each new development, which means the story ends up feeling rushed or even oversaturated at times. But I still think this was fantastic. I would definitely recommend it, and I gave it 4 stars. After that, I picked up another highly anticipated 2026 release. That was The Last Best Quest Ever by F.T. Lukens. Simon Teen kindly sent me a review copy, and this one just recently came out on May 26th. This is another delightfully silly queer YA fantasy parody from F.T. Lukens. It's about Eleanor, one of the most celebrated and accomplished questers in the entire kingdom. But what no one knows is that her fame is built entirely on lies. So she decides to abruptly announce her retirement before anyone can find her out, and she ends up getting trapped in her own lies. However, her chaotic, troublemaking twin brother Zig doesn't know the truth about her reputation and ends up making a hot-headed, spur-of-the-moment bet with some mages that Eleanor can retrieve the horn of the mythical elder beast, a primordial creature that has never been seen. To make things worse, if she doesn't find some way to accomplish this impossible task, her brother will have to literally surrender his heart. So now Eleanor has to embark on the most dangerous quest of her life with her sheltered brother, the non-binary Princet, who's always been her biggest rival, and a few other random hangers-on, while hoping that somehow none of them find out the truth about all her lies in the process. Content warnings for experienced classism, scenes involving abduction, brief scenes containing non-graphic references to animal death, and some descriptions of injury and thematic violence. If you've been here for a second, you will not be surprised to hear that I absolutely love this. F.T. Lukens has never once let me down in the entirety of their career as an author, and they sure as hell were not going to break that streak with this new book. One of the reasons why F.T. Lukens remains one of my all-time favorite authors and auto-read authors is because they're able to strike a really fine balance of creating these sort of parody, satirical, tongue-in-cheek fantasy stories while also touching on really important and impactful thematic concepts. On the one hand, this is a super fun fantasy adventure about a ragtag group of fully unqualified misfits embarking on a life-or-death adventure to save one of their own from the jaws of death. But on the other hand, it's also a thoughtful rumination on imposter syndrome, on not being able to understand your own worth and your own value, on the urge to downplay your own contributions and accomplishments just because they might not fit into the dominant social narrative. I think a big piece of this story is how Eleanor severely doubts herself and is unable to see herself clearly. She feels like she's a fraud because the kingdom thinks she's done all these grandiose, heroic things, and the truth is that she's always been able to meet the brief when it comes to whatever quest or adventure she takes on, but she also thinks outside the box and tries to find peaceable, nonviolent, inventive ways to complete those quests. So instead of slaying a mythical creature, for example, she might help to move it to a safer location. And in her mind, because she's found workarounds for so many of her adventures and she hasn't taken care of business in the way that the kingdom and townsfolk expect her to as a so-called hero, then that must mean everything she's done doesn't count, whatever that means. And what she's realizing as the story progresses is that she's no less heroic just because the way she works and the way she thinks doesn't fit into that dominant narrative of what a hero or an adventurer is supposed to be or supposed to do. The fact of the matter is that she's still doing these incredible things, but she's doing them in a way that makes sense for her. And I think that's a really important message, especially for young folks, that doing things the hard way doesn't actually change the end result or make it any more impressive. It's the actual doing of the thing that matters in the first place. So I think this story is very much about unlearning those internal narratives that we're not doing enough or that we're not doing things in the quote-unquote right way and therefore we don't deserve good things or don't deserve to feel proud of ourselves. This book is saying absolutely fuck that logic, to which I could not agree more. And at the same time, it also has all the hallmarks of F.T. Lucan's writing: quippy banter, unlikely friendship, an underlying queer slow burn romance, a unique take on familiar fantasy archetypes. It's creative and fun and overall just a really whimsical, delightful time. I did find myself wanting slightly more from the resolution, but I also know it's tough to satisfactorily wrap up a fantasy standalone. Even so, that was a very minor note, and I still gave this a strong 4.75 stars. Then I picked up An Expanse of Blue by Kawakanalehua Mahoa Adams. I kindly received a finished copy from Heartdrum, an imprint of HarperCollins, and it came out on May 19th. This is a YA verse novel written by a Native Hawaiian author about a Native Hawaiian teenager named Aioli who is really struggling with her family life. Her father is very emotionally abusive and controlling. She's navigating what it means to grapple with the Catholic faith that's been forced upon her for her entire life. She might be losing her best friend to the popular crowd, and overall she just feels adrift. The one place she feels truly accepted and free is at her Auntie Ehu's house, where every Saturday their extended Hawaiian community gathers together to share food and company. But when an unspeakable truth about her father comes to light, it threatens to shatter even this one peaceful corner of her life. Content warnings for experienced misogyny, explorations of religious trauma, some experienced fat phobia and body shaming, depictions of a toxic parent-child relationship, some explorations of parental infidelity, brief references to sexual assault, some scenes involving underage drinking and drunkenness, and death of a family member, as well as explorations of grief. This is undoubtedly a heavy story at times, but it's also incredibly thoughtful and really beautifully told. It kind of feels like this book is filling the void of what Ellen Hopkins' books used to be, but for a whole new generation and with a lot more intentionality and care. As loath as I am to admit this, I did read a lot of Ellen Hopkins' books as a teenager, much to my own detriment, because looking back on them as an adult, I can see that a lot of them were sensationalist, reactive, judgmental, and written for shock value as opposed to coming from a place of care. So if you have nostalgia for those kinds of verse novels, but wish you could find one that handles its sensitive topics much more healthily and thoughtfully, then I think you'll enjoy this. I think the best way I can put it is to say that this verse novel acts as a soft place to land rather than a sharp edge pressing against an open wound, if that makes sense. What's more, I think this verse novel uses poetry in verse form to tremendous effect. It's the kind of story that wouldn't read the same way if it were written as prose, because there's so much added depth and emotion that comes from the way it plays with stanza shaping, spacing, and the use of white or negative space. All of those things and even more poetic techniques are used creatively and purposefully to really distinguish the main character's unique point of view and to create a distinctive narrative voice. And again, thematically, the story has a lot of valuable things to say about how there are so many more important things in life than being quiet, pliable, or obedient. There will be moments when the entirety of ourselves is not something that has been anticipated, expected, or accepted, but to be more and to take up more space than we're given is not a shameful thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's a gift. There are two things I will say. One, sometimes there are these big emotional swells in the story that don't always get fully unpacked or get the space they need to really land. And two, I wish the main character was able to feel grounded in her own self-worth, even outside of the budding romance in the story. There are moments when the story plays into the age-old stereotype that romance can heal all things, when that is not necessarily true. But even even taking those things into consideration, I still gave this debut 4.25 stars. Then I picked up my Patreon pick for May, and there was actually a tie in the poll for May, which almost never happens, so I allowed my own vote to be the tiebreaker, which meant I finally got to read The Black God's Drums by my man, P. Jelly Clark. I checked out the audiobook from my library, which is read by Channy Waits. This is like an alternate history sci-fantasy novella about a scrappy teen known as Creeper who lives on the streets of New Orleans and is determined to secure passage aboard a smuggler airship known as the Midnight Robber. Her ticket to getting on board is to tempt Captain Anne-Marie with some secret intel about a kidnapped Haitian scientist threatening to unleash a deadly weapon known as the Black God's Drums. But Creeper also has a secret of her own, which is that Oya, the African Orisha of wind and storms, speaks directly to her in her mind and grants her use of her divine powers, and Oya might just have her own plans regarding this deadly plot. Content warnings for explorations of racism and references to slavery, scenes involving abduction, depictions of war, violence, and gun violence, and some depictions of death. Honestly, I don't have too much to say about this. P. Jelly Clark is one of my favorite and most read authors for a reason, and here he has once again crafted a compelling, concise, fully realized historical fantasy setting and magic system that doesn't overstay its welcome and makes effective use of a short amount of space. This is very much a story tackling the idea of how there will always be people who would rather see the world burn than accept that the world might change in a way that doesn't align with their backwards, strict, limited beliefs and points of view. It's about characters contending with that small-mindedness, bumping up against the boundaries of those very limited points of view, and answering the violence of bigotry with radical expansiveness. So as always, there's a lot of really great ideas put forth by P. Jelly Clark in a very short space, and overall I appreciate what the story is able to accomplish. Do I think it could have landed even better if it had 30 to 40 additional pages? Yes, I do, but that's also just me wanting more of P. Jelly Clark's writing in my life. I still gave this 4.5 stars. Then after finishing and loving the PBS masterpiece adaptation of The Count of Monte Cristo, I was suddenly in the market for an epic revenge tale. So I picked up a Monte Cristo retelling called For She Is Wrath by Emily Varga. This has been out for a couple of years, but I actually picked up a galley from Wednesday Books at the ALA conference back in 2024, and I listened to the audiobook courtesy of Macmillan Audio, which is read by Safia Ingar. This is a Pakistani-inspired romantic fantasy that is also a gender-bent reimagining of The Count of Monte Cristo. It follows a young Pakistani girl named Tanya who was framed for a political murder that she did not commit. Already planning to escape from her high-security prison, one day her path crosses with a fellow prisoner who has her own plans for escape and vengeance. So they decide to work together, and the other girl might just hold the key to a stolen Jinn treasure that can help them pose as nobles and get close enough to the political ambassadors who destroyed their lives so they can finally exact bloody vengeance. Content warnings for explorations of classism, some references to torture and imprisonment, some explorations of parental death and grief, and some graphic depictions of war, injury, and violence. I think this is an outstanding, exciting, refreshing fantasy take on The Count of Monte Cristo. I can't speak to the accuracy or faithfulness of the story because I haven't read from the source, but if I can go off the PBS adaptation, it does feel faithful in its own way, and I think it takes that source material in some really exciting directions. Because it fully separates itself from a European or Eurocentric point of view and also functions as a gender-bent take on Monte Cristo, that allows it to uncover new dynamics and nuances that the reader wouldn't be able to sit with otherwise. Specifically, I found it to be so cathartic to witness Danya's untapped fury and single-minded desperation to exact her revenge no matter the cost. I feel like I was able to appreciate the revenge storyline even more than in the original, especially because we rarely get to see BIPOC women revel in their anger, act in ways that are hateful and destructive rather than pushing down their anger completely or only being allowed to express it in easily digestible, palatable ways. There is nothing palatable or subtle or dignified about the way Danya conducts herself, which is so refreshing to see. Her anger is like a bottomless pit constantly threatening to plunge her into the darkness, and it's just fascinating to watch as she constantly fights to keep a hold of herself and not prematurely reveal her hand to her enemies, as tempting as it might be. And that added layer of Mazen, the boy she once loved, being one of her betrayers, is also such an enticing twist. I can really appreciate that added complexity because it shows how even though Danya has every right to be furious and vengeful, she is still in fact human, and she can't just separate hate from love when there's so much history in one relationship. I also respect how the story is able to build out that relationship between Danya and Mazen, especially because the story begins when she's already in prison. She's already been betrayed. So then the story has to find moments where it can flash back to the origins of their relationship and recursively build out that connection while the revenge plot is progressing forward at the same time. So this is definitely every bit the sweeping, epic, badass revenge tale that you would want it to be, but because it's a fantasy setting, because it's gender bent, because it's set in a Pakistani-inspired world, it's able to take that familiar classic to new and exciting places. It also makes you think about the true cost of revenge. Where exactly do we draw the line between righteous vengeance and becoming the very thing we despise the most? At what point are we rebalancing the scales, and at what point are we merely playing into the very same cycles of violence that we're desperate to escape ourselves? Overall, I thought this was a really wonderful retelling and debut. It definitely made me want to check out more from this author in the future, and I gave it a solid 4.25 stars. As if all that wasn't enough, I decided I still had time enough to squeeze in Diamond Ring by Katie Casey, the third and final companion book in the Unwritten Rules series. This is the third companion book in a series of queer baseball romances. This one happens to be about a major league pitcher named Jake Fisher who gets called up to the big leagues at the same time as a rookie catcher named Alex. So the two of them kind of get paired up together as they kick off their careers in the majors. But after gelling together fairly well and becoming something of a dynamic duo on the field, some kind of awful game-ruining incident happens between them at the Fall Classic. Then we kind of fast forward to a point in time when their professional and personal relationship is still fairly fractured from what happened in that championship series. But even so, they can't seem to stay out of each other's faces on the field or out of each other's beds off of it. And they might just have one last chance to figure out how they can make a winning team again in more ways than one. Content warnings for depictions of anxiety, panic attacks, and obsessive-compulsive habits, references to off-page death by suicide, as well as the death of a parent, allusions to poor care within the foster care system, some experiences of queerphobia, biphobia, ableism, sexism, classism, and anti-Semitism, and some explicit sexual content. Again, if you've been here for a second, it will not surprise you to hear that I love this so much. It brought me so much unbridled joy, just like the previous two books in the series. And I just feel like every book in this companion series got progressively better and better and better until it peaked at exactly the right time in this third book. Like the previous two books, Diamond Ring is somehow able to capture the grand scale of what it means and what it looks like to play in the major leagues, while also managing to capture true moments of intimacy, domesticity, quietude, and ease. I haven't had a chance to talk about this aspect of the series yet, but all three books are able to so perfectly depict the complexity of professional baseball, its unpredictability, the lightning in a bottle kind of dynamic the game thrives off of, the near magic that happens when everything is working and falling into place, while also not romanticizing or glamorizing the sport. In fact, all the characters throughout the series are grappling with the unforgiving nature of the game and the industry itself. There are rookie characters who are not being paid enough to live. There are characters living out of hotel rooms and suitcases. There are characters living in fear of being moved down to the minor leagues or being traded to another team at any given moment. There are characters recovering from injuries and worried about whether they can prove their worth and even have a future in the game they love so much. I just have so much respect for how Katie Casey has depicted the complexity of this sport with so much care and thought and nuance. She actually writes professional baseball analysis, and her deep knowledge of the game and the industry's inner workings really shows on the page. I've said this about the previous two books, but I have to reemphasize how much I love the way each pairing in this series is grappling with both professional tension and romantic tension in their unfolding relationships, which you wouldn't necessarily expect because they all play on the same team, at least at some point. So you wouldn't expect them to be in competition with each other, but again, because baseball is such a competitive, unpredictable, unforgiving sport where rosters are constantly fluctuating, there is that tension. They all want each other to succeed, but not at the cost of their own careers. And there's very subtle variations on that theme that each book gets to explore because the dynamics of each pairing are ever so slightly different. The first book is about two catchers, the second book is about a starting pitcher and a relief pitcher, and this third book is about a pitcher and a catcher. So again, very subtle shifts in pairing dynamics, but all done so incredibly well. And ultimately, this third book is about learning how to love the things in life that are not guaranteed, how it takes work to accept that we often can't control the things we care about the most and want to hold on to the most, but how coming back to those things again and again and caring about them in the best way we can will always be worth it. Again, going back to baseball as a metaphor, it's a game that's so easy to love and enjoy when everything is going right. But learning how to love something or someone, even when it fails you, when it hurts, when it challenges you, when it doesn't meet your expectations, is the true measure of all that love can be. And putting that into practice is a necessary part of life. This was wonderful, to say the very least. It made me feel the full range of human emotion, and even though it gets a little bit sappy towards the end because it has to do that obligatory thing where it brings all the characters together and ensures the reader that they all get their happy endings, I still wouldn't change a single thing about it. I had no choice but to give this third book 5 stars. So there you have it. Those are all the books I read in May. It was a very eventful reading month, to say the very least. But as always, if you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, please stop by the comments down below because I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.